Welcome to all of our participants. We are so thrilled that you are with us today, wherever you are joining from. My name is Lori Peak, and I serve as the director of the Natural Hazard Center here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the monthly Making Mitigation Work webinar series, which is hosted by the Natural Hazard Center and made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. This webinar series highlights recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. Thank you for joining this webinar session, which will feature renowned mitigation researcher and longtime practitioner, Gavin Smith. He will be sharing the results of a national survey on how states build local government capacity to implement hazard mitigation grants and the findings from a comparative assessment of buyout acquisition programs to address hazard-prone housing in the United States and New Zealand. Thank you so much for being here and for the work that you are doing to reduce the harm and suffering from disasters. A few announcements before we begin the formal webinar presentation. This forum is being recorded. The caption video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, hazards.colorado.edu. This is also where you can find the recordings and supplemental materials from the prior Making Mitigation Work webinars, as well as access to many other free resources. Thanks to a partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, or IAEM, we can offer one contact hour of emergency management training through the IAEM certification program. To receive the credit, you are required to attend the entire webinar session today, but we know you're going to want to stay with us for the full hour. Please visit the Making Mitigation Work webpage under the Trainings tab at hazards.colorado.edu for more information. You can contact Katie Murphy at hazctr@colorado.edu for more information on receiving your certificate for attending the webinar today. If at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments, you can offer those either via the chat function or in the Q&A box on Zoom. We will monitor the questions in both places. And Gavin has left some time at the end for question and answer, so we hope that you will, again, use the chat function or the Q&A box. And for those questions we're unable to get to, we will share written responses via the Making Mitigation Work webinar webpage. Now, without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce today's speaker, Gavin Smith. Gavin is a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at North Carolina State University. His groundbreaking research focuses on hazard mitigation, disaster recovery, and climate change adaptation, with an emphasis on integrating research and practice through deep community engagement. Gavin is the author of the book Planning for Disaster Recovery, a review of the United States Disaster Assistance Framework, and co-editor of Adapting to Climate Change, Lessons from Natural Hazards Planning. In addition to his many scholarly publications, Smith recently developed a graduate certificate in disaster resilient policy, engineering, and design, and helped to coordinate a university-wide effort on disaster resilience that spans research, teaching, and engagement-related activities. And last I checked in with Gavin, I think he'd identified hundreds of people across the North Carolina State University campus who were interested in these resilience activities. Gavin has also, throughout his long and storied career, advised many communities as well as governors from both major political parties on post-disaster rebuilding and sustainable recovery. Gavin, we are so honored to have you with us here today. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the controls over to you. So Gavin.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lori. And thanks for using a photograph that I think was about 20 years old. So that's nice. I appreciate that.
Gavin, you still look the same.
Okay, I'm not, okay. Well, whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But anyway, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started. And Lori, if you could just shout out, let me know. If you bear with me just 1 second, let me get it in the right format.
Perfect. And we're seeing it right now. It's just not in the slideshow yet, but the slides look great,
Yeah.
Gavin.
Let's see if, here we go. There we go. Okay. All right. If I'm ready to go, if you are, Lori.
Perfect. Take it away. Thank you.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about two projects, and as the title implies, applied hazard mitigation research. And these two projects are those that have been developed in partnership with the Fema National Office. They'd asked us to take a look at the issue of state hazard mitigation officers' ability to assist local capacity in implementing HMA grants, as well as doing a comparative study of buyouts in the US and New Zealand. Now, I'll talk about both of those to some extent. I'll also talk about specific findings, as well as products we've created, both reports for practitioners and journal articles. And in all cases, and most of the research that I do, I try to create a series of policy recommendations. So I'll talk about those as well. I'll wrap up with some of the future work that we're looking to do. And actually, we'll be starting, in fact, we're starting work on innovative buyouts this month. And I'll talk a bit about that as well. So the first project I wanted to talk about is what we call a capacity to implement FEMA HMA grants. And so what we did is we surveyed state hazard mitigation officers in states and territories, and we wanted to understand four primary elements. One is the degree to which states and territories engage in the programs themselves in terms of their participation in development of policy and programs, including discussions with FEMA to perhaps even modify some of the existing national policies as they understanding the assistance provided by states to local government, states and territories, try to get at or measure the commitment to hazard mitigation at states and territorial levels, and then understanding the perceived local government needs, including low capacity communities. And if in fact there's a match or a mismatch between the capacity of states and territories to administer aid and local governments to receive it. And again, just to make sure we understand the framing of this, it really is focused on the ability to develop and implement hazard mitigation assistance grants. So these are some of the broad categories of the survey that we asked. This was a survey that was originally intended to be, if you will, online, but face-to-face. We were going to do it at Emergency Management Institute in partnership with FEMA during their annual meeting with all SHMOs. Unfortunately, just before we were ready to do that, the pandemic struck, and so we pivoted and we changed to a survey instrument that we ended up sending out to SHMOs based on their email address, and we followed up with them, and I'll talk a bit about the response rates in just a moment. But these are some of the big issues we talked about, both mitigation policies, perceived challenges at the local level. We were asking questions about the degree to which governors were involved process, including helping to look at issues like assessing the hazard mitigation assistance goals of states. We interviewed respondents about the types of assistance provided, the program participation, which I'll talk about in a moment, commitment to hazard mitigation or HMA grant administration. We talked a bit about buyouts, and we also discussed specific questions about low capacity communities. So the response rate, I think, was pretty good. I had hoped it would be a little better, but not bad. 77% response rate among states and territories. You can see that all the regions were represented. Some regions, including 1, 6, and 7, all states and territories participated. One of the challenges we faced, frankly, was tribal recruitment. We were planning to survey states, territories, and tribes, but it proved very difficult to get contact information on tribal representatives. So that's an area of future research and actually something we'd like to take on. Also, territory participation was quite low. We only had one territory participate, which is also disappointing to me personally, because one of the issues we really wanted to get at is understanding the degree to which states, territories, and tribes, including those that have a preponderance of low capacity local governments or tribes in them, to understand need the types of assistance that they need. So in the end, what you'll hear from me in this study is that our findings will almost assuredly overestimate the capacity at a national level. So again, these are some of the issues broken down into more detail. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program participation, we looked at program administration by states and advanced assistance. We found that the delegation of things like benefit cost analysis, environmental review, and so forth under PAS, as well as the degree to which states and territories sought advanced assistance to do things like, for example, pre-study of stormwater management projects, they were significantly underutilized as a resource. And so that brings up important issues of while FEMA, I think appropriately, is trying to figure out how to provide assistance to states and territories up front, local governments up front, there's still the utilization of those efforts are not being utilized. And so that's an issue to certainly explore. Also, the idea of perceived capacity at the state level. The belief is that the ability to meet planning and outreach needs were not problematic. We also found that most of the assistance provided by states and territories tended to be very much focused on administrative needs. And so that's an issue to perhaps think about what other types of aid could be delivered instead of just dealing with administration. When we're looking at state local commitment to hazard mitigation, we found that in many cases, governors had limited involvement, including the oversight of HMA program goals, testifying before members of Congress or committees within Congress, serving as an advocate, if you will, trying to push kind of a mitigation ethic across states and territories. We found that was actually quite limited, and I'll talk about that at the end. This is a paper I'm actually working on. I'm particularly interested in the roles that governors play in hazard mitigation. We also found schmoes were looking for greater leadership to foster commitment. And so, one of the challenges that we're facing is while they believe there needs to be greater leadership, there's still challenges from the perspective of states and territories as to whether that's actually being provided at the local level and in some cases at the state and territorial level. Working with low capacity communities, states and territories recognized that they were problematic. They also recognized that generally speaking, the strategies for identifying and reaching out to these communities were perhaps insufficient. And then finally, attitudes on mitigation funding strategies. This was just a general comment. There were several other questions, but this is a distillation of a much larger survey, is that schmoes generally agreed that high-risk, low-capacity communities should be given some type of prioritization. So some of the recommendations, and I should say, actually, while I'm thinking about it, is because of Converge and the work that Lori did, our survey you can find online, and I believe it's referenced at the end of this presentation. So if you're interested in all of the survey questions, it's open source now. And in fact, I would encourage anyone that's interested in looking at the questions, but also if researchers would want to use the tool in the future to do an additional study, I certainly would encourage that. So a distillation of some broad recommendations, and also in the papers I'll describe in just a moment, or at least point you to, is that these recommendations are spelled out in more detail. So one of the issues that we suggest is to create a stronger emphasis on capacity building that is really focused on technical aspects of grants management, including finance, which is regularly noted as a challenge for local governments to administer, but also open space management or programming and oversight. This is often given less attention, but what we found, and I'll talk about it in another study, is that open space management is often an afterthought, and it leads to really suboptimal outcomes. Another recommendation is to create consistent funding and support to sustain a base level of staffing for grants management. And for those of you at the state and territorial level, you'll know this. I certainly remembered it as a state hazard mitigation officer and a former assistant director of mitigation. Wild fluctuations in state staffing capacity. You staff up after disaster to administer HMGP, and then you lose that staffing because they're often temporary, and then you have another disaster and you staff up. And so you have this significant fluctuation. There really needs to be a standard base level of state and territorial level support, including the ability to deal with turnover. Not surprising, especially if a lot of these positions are time limited or temporary, and they're administering large grant sums. It's not surprising that they would ultimately seek out permanent employment elsewhere. So this is a real issue for us to think about. And then also establish formal networks and communication channels between jurisdictions so that we can share information both in terms of lessons that are actually seem to be working, as well as significant problems, certainly in advance of the influx of HMA dollars. Some other recommendations is to create incentives or incentivize initiatives that bring together jurisdictions that are implementing innovative and successful programs. And I'll talk about this in a moment. We're getting ready to start a national study of innovative buyout programs, and how do we better use those that have developed successful programs that we can clearly codify, and how that information can be used through mentorship to jurisdictions, ideally, certainly before a large infusion of these dollars. Establish state and territorial programs to educate and engage local leaders, advocates, champions, and citizens. And we purposely mentioned leaders, advocates, and so forth. So it's not just looking at mentorship across technical aspects of HMA programs, but also the ability to identify and engage those that can advocate for broader, bigger picture issues like larger investments in hazard mitigation funding at the state level, or looking at trying to inject or create a mitigation ethic at the state and territorial level that ultimately can be brought down to local levels. And then also develop comprehensive strategies to identify and engage low capacity communities. And this is an ongoing issue that we found in the survey, and SHMOs recognized it, but they also recognized that generally speaking, their ability to build the capacity of low capacity communities was lacking. And that we needed to figure out ways to develop strategies that were really tied to a greater or a deeper knowledge and long-term understanding of the characteristics of these communities, and then target aid based on those local conditions, as opposed to a broad brush approach with quote unquote, low capacity communities. There's great variation, and there's different needs that they possess. Switching a bit to the outputs, if you will, these are just, and these slides will be shared, I believe. And so these are just some of the journal articles, for example, in sustainability, as well as the second bullet is the survey. You're welcome to certainly take a look at that as well. And then a report that we've recently finished, or I should say we finished in January. We will be distributing more broadly. In fact, we just met with Fema a week or so ago, talking it through and getting some more feedback. And so we'll be distributing that nationally fairly soon as well. Some future work that we're looking to do is one of my PhD students that I should have mentioned up front, Olivia Villa, and several others that were listed on our first slide, is she is working on an article focused on low capacity communities, and that is actually under development as part of her dissertation work. I am just beginning an article looking at the role that governors play in hazard mitigation grants management. And then also future work, we have proposed presentations at the Natural Hazards Workshop, the researchers meeting, and you can see the list of others that we are thinking about submitting presentations to. And you're literally sitting in on one at the Fema making mitigation work. We're also exploring others like IAEM, and we'll certainly have, if those of you on the line have some ideas, that's certainly an issue to talk about perhaps. So that's a quick review of a fairly large study. And again, you'll see through the other articles and reports more detailed description, but I did want to get through two studies that we are working on. The second is to shift to a kind of a really important part of hazard mitigation, as those of you on the line know, is looking at buyouts, or the acquisition of hazard-prone housing. And for those of you on the line, most of you know in the U.S. they're largely, the homes are acquired they're demolished, the land is turned into open space and maintained as such in perpetuity, thereby reducing the likelihood of future loss of life or property. There are some cases of relocation, but our focus for this study was really on acquisition and demolition that we collectively refer to as buyouts. I will say in New Zealand, they refer to them as buybacks, but basically very similar approaches. And so we looked at the US and New Zealand and spent a fair amount of time in December prior to the pandemic in New Zealand, interviewing officials in a number of communities, and I'll talk about that briefly. But I wanted to summarize some of the general findings. What we found, which I thought was interesting, is that in the US we have well-funded but micromanaged grant programs, and that is has with it its own set of challenges when local governments are trying to administer these highly complex programs. They often find it quite difficult because of the micromanagement in many cases of states and territories versus the US, versus New Zealand, I should say, where there is not a large infusion, a national infusion of dollars on a regular basis like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or now BRIC, but rather the New Zealand government tends to identify existing national programs and then infuse money into them that might better meet the local needs and conditions that are present. And in some cases, they actually create new programs like they did following Christchurch that were tailored for the particular disaster. So it's interesting in some ways those programs are more adaptive, but it's also interesting in many ways to me because they don't have a national program. And I will return to that in a moment because New Zealand is in the midst of creating a national retreat strategy, of which I'm working with colleagues in New Zealand to talk with them about that. Another issue that I think is really interesting is what we found is air quotes around voluntary buyouts in the U.S. and New Zealand, and some of you on this Zoom call might be involved in them. Is the pressures that are often placed on citizens in areas that are subject to buyout that can be pretty intensive, and so some have questioned the degree to which they're voluntary in the U.S. Whereas in New Zealand, especially in Christchurch, which was particularly interesting, is that they deemed areas, they red zoned certain areas that were following the earthquake. Those properties were subject to severe liquefaction, and they deemed those areas unsuitable for rebuilding. In essence, the voluntary nature of the buyout didn't exist, but one of the things that happened is there are thousands of contiguous parcels that have been bought out. And it's really interesting because New Zealand has played an important role in trying to think through and plan for the utilization of that land, including what they call regeneration plans. Whereas in the US, open space is often an afterthought, and if communities have the resources and the political will and the technical expertise, and they brought on the right people to think through how those open spaces can become a community asset, that's good and that's great. But there are many cases throughout the US where open space management is often viewed as a burden, and those lands are often left underutilized. One other issue that I think is particularly interesting is this notion of planning and grants management. And in the US, this is one of our grand challenges is even though we have the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 to be subsumed by BRIC, and this is part of a 6-year study that myself and Phil Burke and Ward Lyles did several years ago, is the connection between planning and grants management. The Disaster Mitigation Act plans often, for example, don't include buyouts or don't include projects. And so planning is often underutilized as a tool, whereas in New Zealand, planning is center to a lot of their disaster management work. However, what's interesting, because they don't have a national buyout program, and they may be in search of buyout funding, planning can last for years and years and years, the idea of a buyout, but unless they have the infusion of money, the best laid plans without an implementation mechanism can be problematic. And then the last element I'll mention relative to the study is that what we found is that, particularly in the US, we're really not doing a very good job of drawing lessons That's one of the reasons we want to continue to do work in New Zealand and compare with what's going on in the US, is that the lesson drawing within and across countries hasn't really been utilized very effectively. And there's a long-standing history of that in the US in particular. We tend to spend a lot of money on the post-disaster aftermath, but we are doing much too little on the pre-event planning for post-disaster recovery and pre-event planning for hazard mitigation. So some of the recommendations that we came up with, and again, these are written up in both a report that I'll allude to in a moment, as well as a couple journal articles that are forthcoming, is that we really need to work on reducing the complexity of the buyout programs, but also recognizing that buyout programs, we need to do a better job of giving states and local governments the latitude to deal with local conditions and recognize that not every state, not every community is the same. And so when we have highly complex and actually quite narrowly defined buyout programs, it creates significant problems across the board unless you have the resources, the technical capacity, the staffing, and the prior experience to administer them. It's often quite difficult to administer them in a timely manner. We also need to provide more direct pre- and post-disaster technical assistance. There is assistance provided in the aftermath of disasters to administer things like the HMGP and others, but I would argue that we still are not doing nearly enough to direct pre-event technical assistance to these communities in advance, but also in the aftermath. Thinking through how we can improve land use planning and buyouts. The idea of including buyout projects and hazard mitigation plans, while encouraged, they're often not included. Many of you know at the state and local level that some communities don't want to do that because if it is codified or if it's in a plan, that could, at least in theory, affect property values. It's a voluntary program, so some people may not want their properties listed. So there's some real specific challenges as to the ability to do this, but I do think we need to do it. And I'll just give you a quick example. In North Carolina, in Kinston, following Hurricane Fran, it took almost a year to develop an application to buy out about 300 houses. We ran out of money at this time. I was at the state. The city agreed to develop a pre-disaster application for an additional 600 homes. Hurricane Floyd struck 3 years later. Because they had a pre-disaster plan in place for the buyout of those 600 homes, the state, at that time when I was there, we were able to get those 600 homes approved 2 weeks after the storm. I mean, that, for those of you that have administered those programs, that's lightning speed. We also had a governor that was aligned with the president of the United States at the time, Bill Clinton. So there were a lot of things that allowed us to do that, but there's really no reason in my mind why we can't be doing more of that kind of work. The other issue that I'll mention, and I mentioned it briefly, is we need to improve the delivery of technical assistance. And one area that's really needed, and it's not being done systematically, is open space programming and management. And in places where it is being done, whether it's wealthy communities or if in fact it is universities or others providing assistance to local governments to think through what to do with land post-buyout, we often end up with suboptimal outcomes. And again, I mentioned that improving the need for lesson drawing within and across nations. These are some of the outputs of the study. The first bullet is a report led by a colleague of mine, Wendy Saunders, and myself. I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then we also, there is an article forthcoming that myself and my student research team have written. And then we've also finished a book chapter that's in press. It will be out this year. And one of the issues that we're working on, and Wendy is leading this article, is thinking about a set of global principles that should be guiding the acquisition of hazard-prone housing, regardless of where we are, what country or what state, what location. And so that's also under. So nearing the end of my talk, I wanted to give us plenty of time for question and answer. I wanted to mention a few things that we're doing now. We're starting now. We're going to be documenting innovative practices across FEMA-funded buyout programs, and we're going to be looking at, I was just critical of the buyout process, and there have been many other academic and applied articles that have been critical of the buyout process, and justifiably so. It's very complicated. It's very time consuming. It's often administered in the aftermath of a disaster. We're not doing good enough planning for buyouts, if you will, and we're not doing enough planning for the resulting open space. Those are all real. There's also issues of deep place attachment and the equity of buyouts. All of these issues have been well documented in the literature, and again, they're spot on. But what we want to do is we want to identify policy innovation, if you will, and try to capture what is it that allows communities to innovate. And we're going to be looking at two elements of policy innovation theory, both policy diffusion, the degree to which lessons, if you will, are not only learned but shared and adopted. We often talk about best practices, or we often talk about lessons learned. To be honest, a lot of those documents, the lessons learned documents, aren't codified. They often aren't shared. And so there's a real need to move beyond the platitudes, but rather get to understand more specifically how is innovative policy shared, and how is it ultimately absorbed or taken up? And then also the internal determinants model. What are those variables? What are those characteristics that are more likely to be found in those communities that are doing innovative buyouts? And I'm happy to report we're actually, in fact, we just reached out to one of our first test cases this week, and we're looking to begin interviews of those in this month. We're then, once we start that, we're going to be identifying New Zealand communities, continuing the work that we've been doing with New Zealand and with Wendy Saunders and others. And what I think is really prescient is that it's tied to the idea of New Zealand's new, or emerging, I should say, national retreat strategy. And they're right in the midst of doing that. Wendy and some of her colleagues are involved in that discussion. And fingers crossed with inoculations, and if they'll allow people from the U.S. into New Zealand, we're still not sure, but certainly hoping to actually conduct a presentation on some of this work and the work that Wendy and I have been doing in New Zealand this fall. And so proposed work for the upcoming year. When I mentioned the innovative work, we're just starting that, and that's going to carry us through the summer and into the fall. But we're also proposing a hazard-prone housing open space guide. We've met with Fema to talk about this. It has been submitted to the Department of Homeland Security's Coastal Resilience Center for review and funding. I'm hopeful that it will be. And we're really going to be focusing on the use of open space, but also studying not only studying the issues, identifying those best practices, drawing from the innovation interviews we'll be conducting and others. We're looking to do focus groups and reaching out to other experts to think through the identification of innovative open space across communities of varied capacity. So we don't want to just have an open space guide that will resonate with areas that have the staff, the funding, and the political support needed to do good work. But it should be, we're looking to find cases that will resonate with underserved, perhaps poorer communities that are still doing some interesting open space work. And we're also looking at the idea of potentially not only looking at the documentation of open space management, but even thinking about the idea of identifying thoughtful rescinding areas and the construction of replacement housing, which is an issue that I think is I know it's understudied and recognized, and we need to do more both academically and in terms of practice. We need to do more in that space. One other thing that we're working on, I'm in preliminary conversations with the National Academies of Science as part of the Resilient America Committee. I'm a member of that committee, and I have approached them about doing an international study of buyouts and resettlement that would include not only research gaps, but also gaps in engagement. And then ultimately, what is it we need to do in terms of teaching the next generation of college students about this really important and emerging issue. And we're actively seeking out the resources needed to do that study. And certainly, I'm very excited about it. It's going to be a very large effort. And that's literally just kind of the early stages of development. And so my thinking is that we would have this research engagement and teaching agenda would be part of this large study. We would look to have academics, practitioners, educators, and so forth, including so academics, practitioners, and even perhaps students involved in this effort to look at those three kind of tiers of research, teaching, and engagement, and using that agenda. And this is an issue that it isn't noted on the slides, but there's an issue I'm working on at NC State is to look to create a center that will focus on buyouts and resettlement. And this study through the National Academies could certainly serve as an agenda that could help us move that forward. The other thing I'll mention is that that this study certainly would look to and hope to connect with members of FEMA and those who are administering the building resilient infrastructure in communities, as well as other stakeholders like those of you on this Zoom call at the state level, territorial level, municipal level, and other types of stakeholders that certainly would make sense. So with that, I'm going to stop, and then I will defer to Lori as to how we move forward from here.
Gavin, thank you so much for that dual presentation and that information. And we promised you a great audience, and they have, as always, delivered. There are a number of really thoughtful questions that have come in through the chat and the Q&A. So Gavin, I'm just going to work through both of those boxes, and we'll spend all of our remaining time having you engage with these great questions. So thank you again, Gavin. And we're going to kick off with a question from Lewis, who said, in relation to the first part of your presentation, he said, most of these communities don't participate because they typically can't afford the cost share. Is there a way to provide guidance on non-federal grants that could help with cost share that might get better results from rural disadvantaged counties and communities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's that's an age-old issue. You know, some states are fortunate, like North Carolina, they provide the non-federal match, but many others do a cost share at the state and then ultimately municipal. In some cases, they expect individual participants to pony up some of the cost share. So the idea of identifying other, I think that's a great idea, identifying other potential sources that could serve as match. You know, it's been a long time since I actually administered the hazard mitigation grants. You know, certainly CDBG years ago could be used for that purpose, if in fact there was a certain percentage of dedicated to communities of lesser capacity. I don't frankly have a list of other grants that could be utilized, but it does bring up an important point, is that in order to even know what those grants are, you have to have a certain baseline level of knowledge. And, you know, the communities that are struggling to administer these grants, they don't have the time to seek it out. And so I would suggest that goes back to the idea of the mentoring recommendation that we had, where other communities or states or territories that had knowledge of other grants that could serve as the cost share, those kinds of lessons should be shared. But, you know, unfortunately, I would suggest that they're not being done systematically.
Thank you for that, Gavin. And we have another question from Richard Downer, who really put an idea out there that it would be great to hear you respond to. He said, what about creating some kind of national cadre of active FEMA engineers and BCA specialists who the state hazard mitigation officers could reach out to? And then he went on to expand a little more in the comments where he said that the cadre members could actually speak directly to some of the applicants, because Richard is a former SHMO from Vermont. And he said that he found that many of the potential applicants, they have great ideas, but they're totally overwhelmed by the paperwork. They just don't have the resources to develop that scope of work or to undertake the preliminary engineering exploration to complete the BCA. So what do you think of that idea, Gavin? Have you seen anybody do that?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I had written a bit about this in the book that I've written in 2011 on planning for post-disaster recovery, where I made the suggestion that we need to have a disaster recovery cadre of people that are ready to go, you know, drawing on the mutual aid agreements. And one of the central premises of that book was there's a lot of institutional capacity that we have dealing with response, like mutual aid agreements and so forth, but they tend to be strongly weighted towards response. And so sharing information or sharing resources like a cadre of people that could deal with hazard mitigation and long-term recovery, I think is a great idea. And it really goes back to one of the other recommendations we were saying, is that there needs to be a greater investment in capacity building. And that certainly could be, a great, that's one of many, I think, great ways to build the capacity, because it's not just sending more money, but it's also building the personnel capacity needed to do stuff. And that could be provided by other groups like the assistance cadre that was suggested. I think that's a great idea.
Nice. Thank you. And thanks for tying that to your work on recovery as well. So that's something I was intrigued by in your presentation, Gavin. You use this concept of the mitigation ethic several times. And I think April has a great question here that I think ties into that. So April said, codifying hazard mitigation goals and principles has been really challenging for us in Horry County Rising. We created the Horry County Rising 501c4 to advocate for enhancing laws. And she says, what strategies do you suggest or resources can we use to help improve political willpower for enhancing local laws and mitigation projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's that's something I've really been interested in for a long time, and in some ways been very fortunate that I've been able to work for several governors that are advocates, like Governor Hunt in North Carolina. He was advocating for this type of work and pushing for state resources that would allow that to happen. But at the local level, trying to find that advocate, I guess one thing I would suggest, and it kind of goes back to the need to recognize that all communities are different, is that the advocate may be, that was also referenced in the book the book I did in 2011, is the need to identify advocates from a range of entities. For example, I think back to Ann Patton in Tulsa. She was a newspaper reporter and kept reporting about floods and said, we got to do something better. And she ended up being an advocate. So she was a newspaper reporter. Whereas in other cases, I found some communities didn't want to assist communities of color. Frankly, it was that unfortunate. And so there was a nonprofit that stood up and served as their advocate. So I think it's critical to try to identify and spend the time who are the respected leaders in the community. They don't have to be a technical expert. They might have, the ear of someone in power, or they might have great respect. They might be a person of faith that has a great respect among the congregants. So it really does depend. So I think the ability to identify leaders and thinking about casting a broad net for them is important. And also thinking about how they could be kind of non-traditional. They might not be a technical grants administrator. They might be someone that's interested in environmental justice.
Excellent. Thank you. I have a follow-up question from Carrie that connects to the first question on the matching funds. So Carrie said they will look through the survey that you have published, but said, I'm curious whether or not your survey addressed the non-federal match that is required under HMA programs, just because it shares the concern that states and communities are finding difficult in some cases to address the match. So anything else from your research on, did you look specifically at where the match is coming from, if anywhere?
We did. I think there's a general category of kind of baseline information about the states and territories. And so we did ask some general questions about, does your state or territory provide the non-federal match and that type of thing. But we didn't go much farther than that. Now, certainly one of the things that we could do in the future, because what I did today was present to you some general descriptive statistics, is to start to do some analyses that would look at, those states and territories that did provide the non-federal match, and then looking at some of their other responses and doing some other types of more detailed analyses.
Nice. Thank you. And I'm going to bounce over to the Q&A box now because we have a lot of questions over there too. And then Kelly, no, I'll come back to the chat with you next up. So in the Q&A box, Patricia asked, she said, I was surprised to hear your study had problems accessing contacts for tribal communities because those are fairly well established by FEMA and HHS. Why was that difficult? Was it something to do with COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. We just were not able to get those contacts. I don't know that I've got a great answer for you. We reached out several times and tried, but we weren't able to get the contacts of tribes. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for you, but that was something we tried repeatedly and weren't able to get those contacts.
Well, thanks, and thanks for how you ended your presentation by noting you're really looking forward to building those collaborations. So hopefully Patricia may be a person to connect with too. So thanks for that. And then Alex Greer is on here, who I know was a recent invitee to your graduate class, Gavin. So Alex said, really interesting project, Gavin. How are you determining whether a program was innovative or successful?
Yeah, so part of it is, that's a great question, Alex. Good to hear from you. Through our translator, Lori, so we're looking at part of that is going to be self-defining among the respondents, and so we're also going to be looking at things like speed of delivery and other variables that we're still fleshing out.
And then I sort of related to that, I'm going to bounce back over to Kelly in the Q&A because Kelly asked for a little more elaboration on the difference in voluntary buyouts and said, is there a difference in the rights associated with private land ownership in the two-country study that you did with colleagues in New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the U.S. context, by law, the idea of buyouts, given that I'm getting a little feedback, I don't know, do you hear a little feedback?
A little bit, but you're still coming through really well.
Okay, so in the U.S. context is given that it's federal dollars by law, property, they cannot be taken without just compensation. But in this case, the federal dollars that the individual homeowner has to voluntarily participate. And so there's more of a almost peer pressure sometimes placed on participants by neighbors. And we've heard some anecdotal evidence of pressure being put on them by local government officials, which is certainly illegal in the U.S., whereas in New Zealand, it's interesting that when you ask representatives from New Zealand, they often won't say that this was a mandated buyout. But when you really look at the details, in essence, they're saying that this land was deemed red zone. You're not going to be allowed to rebuild back on it. And so you need to take the buyout. I mean, the buyout is we're providing funding for you. And so the idea of the voluntary nature of the buyout in New Zealand is different, and it's different in part because of associated land use laws.
Thanks for that. And we have a couple of related questions in the chat and Q&A. So I'll go to one of our attendees said, what are specific areas, components in the application development or implementation of buyout projects that you recommend for streamlining? How do you propose further streamlining the FEMA benefit cost analysis?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'll tell you a quick story. And again, this is the realities of buyouts, because it's not just technical, but it's also political. And one of the things that we did after Hurricane Floyd is we didn't do benefit cost analysis to determine cost effectiveness, which sounds crazy to people. What we did is we looked at a depth damage function inside the floodplain, and the homes were deemed environmentally uninhabitable by a local building official. That was cost effective. That saved us probably 1.5 years in terms of processing time because we didn't do benefit cost analysis. And the way we were able to do that is because this is what we suggested. We were able to do some sampling of those, and using benefit costs, we found that they were cost effective. We used that information coupled with Governor Hunt's political influence in Washington with, at that time, James Lee Witt and the President of the United States. And we were able to do that. Many other states in that same disaster were not. So my point is we coupled what I would suggest good data with political power to achieve the ends that we thought were right and just in our state. But we had a unique confluence of factors. We had detailed analysis, we could back it up, and we had political support. And I guess one thing I'll also say, and I want to make sure I don't fail to do this, is just that at FEMA, Bob Shea, for those of you that are on the call from FEMA, those just a near and dear to my heart. Bob was an amazing man. And he fought with us he saw the value in doing that. And so there was leadership in FEMA that also recognized the legitimacy of that effort. So that's one kind of unusual story. But I think determining cost effectiveness goes beyond, just utilization of benefit cost analysis. And FEMA is doing more to monetize environmental benefits and others. So that's a good thing. But I think the benefit cost analysis tool and requirement is one of many that is very difficult to administer. And if you don't have the resources and the expertise to do it, some communities don't participate at all. Or they try to hire a contractor and they may or may not, they may be reticent to do it because they have to front the money. And so that's just one example. Now, what I will say is that what's also interesting is that FEMA has developed advanced assistance and program administration by states. And so in theory, the program administration by states could allow the states to do more benefit cost analysis on behalf of locals. And the advanced assistance is money that could be given to local governments to do some of this work up front. So FEMA is making an effort to deal with these issues, but what we found in our survey is it's still not enough. So, there's more work to be done. There's some examples of progress, but I'm hoping that the findings of this study will help perhaps place greater attention on the importance of pre-event work.
Absolutely. Thank you. And a question from David is going to tie into your state of North Carolina, Gavin. So David says, one of the things that I find frustrating and not often discussed is that while we're spending public money to buy out properties in harm's way, public policy is allowing new properties to be built and sold for private profit in high-risk areas. In a conversation with researchers in North Carolina, it was mentioned that for every structure being removed from a high-risk area, 10 more are being developed in risky areas. Gavin, how do you reconcile this disconnect?
Yeah. No, that's one of the big questions. So you could look that up. I'm very interested in thinking about an aggregate risk assessment, kind of in a watershed scale, and we came up with a method to do this in general. It was more of an experiment, but that was one of my concerns after Hurricanes Fran and Floyd. We brought out over 6,000 homes, but you could see new development occurring in the floodplain. So after all of that, and now in North Carolina, 8,000 and counting homes have been bought out, we don't know if we're reducing the aggregate risk in our floodplains. We just don't know. Now, new development is occurring in accordance with the most recent codes and standards, but there's still some residual risk. My point is we don't know. We don't know how much we're buying down the risk if you're buying out 8,000 homes and you're building 30,000 homes in the floodplain to higher code. We just don't know where are we in terms of the aggregate risk. So one is I think we need to be thinking about that, but two, I think that FEMA needs to be given greater authority because FEMA knows that land use planning, generally speaking, is done at the local level, although there are examples of where federal and state law influence land use planning, and yet FEMA, I would suggest that FEMA needs to be given greater authority, and some would say this is a bit heavy-handed, but if we're going to be doing large-scale buyouts, we ought to be doing land use planning at the same time in these same areas, and that communities need to be held more accountable for these development decisions. And so I have suggested that if you're doing buyouts, or even if you're not, and your hazard mitigation plan ought to address not just identifying potential projects that look into the past, looking at structures at risk in the future, but your hazard mitigation plan needs to do a much more specific and codified job of land use planning as a risk reduction strategy. Otherwise, I don't know that we're going to ultimately, we're dramatically overcounting, I think, the benefits of hazard mitigation when we don't include the cost of continued development. So I think that hazard mitigation plans actually need to develop more of a land use planning element to them, and they need to be codified and they need to be more rigorous. That said, we also have to invest more money on the front end to give the communities the capacity and the tools and the staffing they need to think through land use planning. A lot of small communities don't have land use planning capabilities. So again, it goes back to pre-event investments to me.
Thank you. Gavin, a couple of attendees just wanted to know, will you elaborate why was New Zealand chosen as for comparison with the US?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of it is, in fact, I should be clear, is that we're also doing work in Australia. And, the US, New Zealand, and Australia share some similar characteristics and some are somewhat different. Constitutional monarchy versus our own system of government, but we also have significant investments in urban areas on the coast. We have a multitude of hazards that we face. We've got similar yet sufficiently different kind of hazards management programs and policies. And so those are some of the reasons why we were looking at that. And then also I happen to have been doing work in New Zealand and Australia for several years. And so I have colleagues and others there that are interested in partnering.
Nice. And here's a question from Jennifer. So Jennifer asks, how can mitigation better fit into a holistic approach, in particular in low capacity communities, which I know is of great concern to you, Gavin. Jennifer went on to say some of these communities typically face significant day-to-day challenges like lack of adequate water supply, emergency response equipment and personnel, and transportation, and are also at the front lines of climate change impacts. Too often the needs prioritized by the community are not mitigation in a pure sense, but mitigation can play a role in finding a solution. Are policies, micromanagement, the hurdles to overcome, or other suggestions for low capacity communities in particular, Gavin?
Yeah, that's again, these are great questions. So this is one of the grand challenges in mitigation, is that we don't have deep, long-standing engagement with these communities. And I don't mean long-standing as in 6 months or a year, but rather it should be ongoing and never-ending, to talk with communities, understand what their goals and values are, think about from the standpoint of someone that really knows about hazard mitigation, how it fits into things like, let's say that rural communities or riverine communities are very interested in creating recreational destinations, ecotourism or what have you. Or they're also facing a declining downtown. How do you creatively link up risk reduction initiatives with some of the big challenges they've got, including very low capacity? We did some of that after Hurricane Matthew. The governor and the director of North Carolina Emergency Management asked me to put together a team to assist 6 hard-hit low-capacity communities after Hurricane Matthew. And we did that, and we focused on things like open space management post-buyout. What do you do with the land afterwards? Thinking about the retrofitting or even resettlement of historic downtowns, and identifying rescinding areas so you didn't lose the tax base of small communities and so forth. And we did that, and we spent, myself included, in a team of about 20 academics and about 30 graduate students, give or take. Let's see, about 25 graduate students and about 15, I got my numbers mixed up, about 15 faculty, and worked with them for almost a year. And then we ended up having to stop, and that wasn't nearly long enough because the grants, the HMGP grants and others, were just starting to be rolled out a year after the storm. So my point is, while we engaged and committed significant resources up to a year, almost full time in these communities, it wasn't long enough. It should have been 5 years, 10 years. And so to me, that's one of the great challenges, is how do we work with universities and with states and with regional planning organizations and others to build a more systemic way, and perhaps certainly it's with, in particular universities that have ag extension arms, to work with, say, ag extension agents, could be the Extension Disaster Education Network and others, to offer long-term, in fact, in some cases, ongoing assistance to try to link up risk reduction with community goals. That's a kind of a long-winded answer to say that we're not doing nearly enough in that space. And I would suggest that we need to come up with better collaborative mechanisms to do that, including providing more money on the front end to build those partnerships.
And Gavin, that is a beautiful call to action and aspirational goal for all of us to strive toward. And I'm getting ready to do something very hard right now, which is to acknowledge we have over 30 additional questions that have rolled in through the chat and Q&A, which I think just speaks to your expertise and the desire to engage with you. But we are now at the end of our time. And so everyone, please join me in offering a warm round of thanks in the chat to Gavin. And please know we will be sharing the video and also the slides from this presentation for those of you who inquired about that. And we will send the questions we didn't get to today to Gavin to ask for written responses, and we'll post those as well. So Gavin, thank you so much for your time today. We also want to make sure and thank Fema and the National Science Foundation for making this webinar series possible and for allowing us to bring great speakers like Gavin and all of us together. And so thank you so much. And just a last couple of brief announcements before we go. Please know if you are looking to get the 1 contact hour towards your CEUs for emergency management training, you can reach out to us here at the Hazard Center and Katie will absolutely assist you. And then finally, we ask that you please save the date for our next Making Mitigation Work webinar, which will be on Tuesday, May 11th, 2021 from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. And we'll focus on mapping risk, the National Risk Index for Natural Hazards. And so for now, on behalf of the entire Natural Hazard Center team, we want to thank Gavin Smith for the outstanding presentation and to all of you for joining us today. We wish you all a safe and happy and healthy rest of your week. And please remember to take care of yourself and others. We will see you all soon. Thank you.